Thank you for having me and opening up this space. Um, I'm happy to answer any questions. I guess my preliminary thoughts is, everyone is entitled to their opinion. Everyone is entitled to their critiques, whether they're valid or invalid. Um, and I do expect there to be some level of respect when we're having these conversations. So I'm just actually really glad that you stepped up to curate this space where we can actually have a respectful, intellectual conversation. And the only thing I'll say is, and I think this was said in the other space where, and this is noted, right? The task force had its last hearing on the same day where the Supreme Court delivered its decision on race conscious affirmative action. And a quick note on that decision, right? A lot of people think that the decision was, or the legal question that the Supreme Court was trying to resolve was whether race based admission preferences would be deemed constitutional in public institutions and private institutions. But that actually wasn't the question. The question was whether race conscious admissions preferences could be deemed constitutional. So that's a subtle distinction, but it needs to be made because I was just actually listening to UC Berkeley Law School Dean Erwin Chemerinsky was on a panel about the implications of this Supreme Court decision just a couple of days ago, hosted by the Othering and Belonging Institute. And if I can find the video, I'll put it in the jumbotron where he said it um, very well, where he pretty much asked, right, race-based admission preferences have been illegal per se since Grutter v. Bollinger's, like over 20 years ago. They said you can't have race-based preferences, but they said you can have race-conscious preferences. So basically, they said that race cannot be the only factor, the sole factor that admissions officers can consider when they're thinking about who to select to their student body. But it's been good law to say, well, race can be one of many factors, right? Until this past Thursday, where they said, no, race based not good, and neither is race conscious. And so Dean Erwin Chemerinsky in that panel a couple of days ago, he was pretty much begging the question, asking what changed, right? Because Grutter versus Bollinger, they say you can have race-based admission preferences, but you can have admissions preferences. That was 20 years ago. Then you have Fisher versus Texas, which was 7 years ago, where they said, okay, race conscious is okay. The three dissenting justices were the conservatives, Thomas, Alito, and Roberts. So again, Chemerinsky begged the question, what changed where 7 years ago in Fisher versus Texas, the majority said race conscious admissions are okay to now to last Thursday, where the majority of courts said actually race conscious admissions are unconstitutional. Chemerinsky said, well, was there some relic in the 14th Amendment, some page in historical record that these justices forgot to look at in that 7 year period? No. The law is the law. The historical record is a historical record. What changed was the composition of the courts. The three dissenting justices, the conservative justices, who were against race conscious admissions in Fisher versus Texas 12 years ago, like I said, were Alito, Justice Thomas, and Roberts. Now, those three men were now joined in the majority with the Trump appointees, Gorsuch, Amy Coney Barrett, and Kavanaugh. And those six people made up the majority, the conservative majority, that struck down race conscious admissions. So now this goes back to why am I saying all this? This goes back to what you said when you opened the space, Naheem, when you're saying, when we're talking about reparatory justice, where we're actually trying to change the material lives and conditions of Black folks, of Black Americans, of freedmen, right? We cannot approach this from an emotional standpoint. We have to, like Fred Hampton of the Black Panther Party said, we have to approach this with a level of dialectical materialism. You have to approach um, things from a realistic point of view and not from an emotional point of view, right? And so I say all that to say the law of the land says at this point, race can't be the only factor, let alone one of infinite factors. So now what do we do, right? What do we do with that reality? Not from an emotional standpoint, but from a dialectical materialist standpoint. What do we do? And I think that's where the Freedmen terminology comes in. It's a dialectical materialist intervention to actually achieve our liberation on our own terms. Now, the last thing I'll say, and then I'll get some feedback from you all, is again, Dean Erwin Chemerinsky over a year ago, when we invited him to provide legal expert testimony, when the task force was trying to decide around an eligibility standard, race or lineage, status, class, however you want to define it, it was UC Berkeley Law School Dean Erwin Chemerinsky who actually predicted the outcome of the Supreme Court's decision on affirmative action over a year before they actually decided it. And he correctly predicted and warned us that this court was going to do what it did, which was strike down race-conscious admissions, right? Pretty much foreclosing being able to use race altogether, because again, race-conscious is like, it's just whether race can be a factor. Like Dean Erwin Chemerinsky was trying to illustrate how conservative these courts have become over time. And we can get into a whole nother room about how that's an intentional strategy by conservatives via the Federalist Society. And so for most instances, liberals and leftists are 30, 40 years behind in packing the courts in the sense that these conservatives have done. But again, that's another story for another day. So I say all that to say, he correctly predicted the outcome. Wisely, the task force, at least the majority, voted in favor of a lineage-based standard. Now, can you imagine if it was the opposite? If the task force ignored the legal expertise of a legal scholar, whereby every single casebook that any law school student uses is written by him. If you want to learn about constitutional law, can you imagine if the task force ignored his sound advice, went with the race-based standard, and on the same day as our last hearing, where all of our recommendations would be race-based, the morning of, the Supreme Court pretty much forecloses race-based remedies? Can you imagine the tone of that last hearing? It would be extremely somber. By and large, there would be nothing to celebrate. But that wasn't the tone. But that wasn't the tone of the hearing. It was very celebratory. It turned into a rally. Yeah, it turned into church. I mean, we were energized. We were, not to say that we were happy that the Supreme Court ruled the way that it did. Of course not. But we were happy because, again, we're carving out a legal strategy where we can live to fight another day, right? And that's what this is about. Being able to approach things from a dialectical materialist position, not from an emotional standpoint, so that we can actually change the material conditions of our people, is where I stand.
And that's a powerful point. And
yeah, the only thing, 2 points. Yeah, I mean, in the other space, and I don't mean to like give air to the other space, but I just want to point this out. Like, in the other space, the host was mixing up the different tests of judicial review. So in definitely spreading misinformation to the room by saying that, all classifications, race, sex, gender, all trigger strict scrutiny. That's not true. Like, that's not true. And I already broke down the 3 judicial review tests in 2 spaces beforehand, where I talked about how racial classifications are per se suspect under constitutional law and trigger what is called strict scrutiny, which is the most stringent, most difficult standard to overcome, right? If your governmental policy is based on race, then that means the government would have to prove that this policy serves a compelling government interest and that the policy is narrowly tailored to achieve that interest, right? If you study constitutional law, you'll understand how that is an almost impossible barrier to overcome, and the ways in which that test has been constructed and interpreted over time, right? Sex and gender classifications, that triggers intermediate scrutiny. So that's a lesser standard for any government, a government who is trying to implement a policy on the basis of gender or sex. It's a lesser standard, but it's still a hard standard to overcome. All other classifications, right? AKA race neutral classifications, classifications that do not involve gender or sex, fall within rational basis review, which is the lowest standard of review. And any policy that fits within that classification, it's an easier standard for the government to overcome. All the government has to prove is that this policy serves a rational basis, and the goals and outcomes meets that rationale, right? So I can't argue. Like I love to just be around my people and talk about this stuff, but I can't be in a space with someone who's spreading misinformation after being in those last two spaces. So you're getting free game from me about constitutional law. You don't got to get into six-figure debt like I did. I'm giving you free game. But and you're still taking it upon yourself to spread misinformation and say stuff like gender and sex. It triggers strict scrutiny when that's just fundamentally wrong. If you're passionate about this, go to law school. Honestly, just go to law school so that you can actually talk about this in a way that makes sense, where you're not spreading misinformation. The second point that I have to say is the host in the space, he said he lives in California. Well, you live in California, you're politically active, you would know that California banned affirmative action in 1996.
And Michigan.
Race-based classifications have been illegal since 1996 in California. Was the host of the space active a few years ago when there was a coalition of groups trying to repeal Proposition 209 so that race-based classifications could be considered? Probably not.
Talk to him,
Probably
sis.
not. And so the third point, getting off of that space and getting into the legalities, you're right, Naheem. When you read that Supreme Court decision for affirmative action, it's interesting to note, I said this in the other space, where you have big law firms like Kirkland Ellis, Hogan Lovells, they're writing briefs to their corporate clients about the implications of this affirmative action decision on workplace affirmative action, because education affirmative action and workplace affirmative action is slightly different, but similar. So the whole purpose of these big law firms writing these briefs are to inform their corporate clients about any similarities or distinctions so that they're prepared and they understand what to do now that there's a change in law. And if you read these briefs, I'll try to put it in the pin link. If you read the briefs, they point out correctly, to your point, Naheem, that let's take, for instance, Harvard University and University of North Carolina. Those are the two institutions that were defending their affirmative action policies before the Supreme Court, right, this past year. University of North Carolina and Harvard defended their affirmative action policies to what Naheem said, based on the educational benefits of achieving diversity, aka diversity for diversity's sake, right? This is what some of the justices interpreted, that they interpreted that basing of your affirmative action on achieving the educational benefits of diversity as too amorphous, too vague to quote unquote justify discriminating against someone because of their race. And so I say all that to say, the University of North Carolina and Harvard, like I said, based or defended their affirmative action policies on that vague standard. They did not base their diversity policies on the basis of remediating past harms. Why is that important? Because in that Supreme Court case, they conceded, the conservatives who were trying to strike down affirmative action and the majority conceded that what's called the remedial exception is still good law, which means if, in fact, the University of North Carolina and Harvard based or constructed their affirmative action policies not on the amorphous concept of achieving diversity for diversity's sake, but on remediating past harms, they would still have their affirmative action policy intact. See,
Come on now.
See, people don't understand. So, I mean, people are seeing this affirmative action, the ruling from an emotional place. See, African Americans, Black Americans, American freedmen, we should be pinpointing on that. Okay, we understand that the way that they constructed their policies, achieving a diversity for diversity's sake, that hasn't helped us. I'm a living testimony of that. I went to Columbia Law School. That is an Ivy League law school. The majority of Black law students in that law school were not descendants of American slaves. They just weren't. And they haven't been. And I wrote a whole thesis. I wrote a whole paper on that before I even knew what an ADOS was. Okay? For an intersectionality seminar. And so the paper was around, instead of constructing your affirmative action policies for diversity's sake, how about you get back to the original intent of what affirmative action was about, which was remediating past harms for these descendants of slaves, who our ancestors were not allowed to read or write and were killed if we tried to do so. And then after we were emancipated, you know how we were denied equal education and stuff like that. So basically, that's the nuance, that's the caveat that people aren't picking up in this case, right? The remedial exception is still good law. Affirmative action was struck down because of the way in which these institutions base their argument. If they base their argument not on, we want affirmative action just to achieve diversity, but on actually remediating past harms, again, they would still have their policies in place. And it would obviously then benefit us, because when we talk about the specific history of University of North Carolina, when we talk about the specific history of Harvard, these are institutions built by slave labor, financed by slave labor. So I'm gonna just stop there and just say, like, we can have this conversation, but you know, it's kind of like that old adage when like two fools arguing, or two people are arguing, you can't tell which one is a fool. Like, I can't continue to go into spaces with people who are just bad faith actors. So that's why I appreciate this space.